My friend and I decided to go on a late-night drive to find this creepy cemetery one night. Great start to a story, I know, but we were bored and in a small town with nothing else to do. After close to 40 minutes of driving, we got to the state park. Now typically, parks are closed after dark, but these roads were still public access, so they weren't off limits to general drivers. However, we were the only cars on the road at this point, and it was isolated, we thought. The lanes were surrounded by thick trees, and it was dark. No streetlight dark. We're on a narrow dirt lane looking for this cemetery, but we drive by it, unknowingly. The area we were driving through was kind of like a square of roads with only one way in and out. We get to the crossroads, where the road we are on goes straight through, or you can continue back through by a left-only turn. Next to the ditch across the road from us, we see a dark green sedan pulled into the brush, no lights on, no people around it, not an accident from all we could tell. Whatever, kind of weird, but we slowly turned left and began to loop back around looking for the small rows of old headstones again. As we get back around the intersection about 5 minutes later, the green sedan is still pulled off in the bushes. But now, it's not the only vehicle there. There's a big pickup truck, idling in the dark across from us, blocking the straightaway. Now, it had to have come from the other direction since no other cars passed us or were in front of us or behind us. That was the way we had planned to go, to leave the park since we hadn't found what we were looking for, but we couldn't pass through. This truck was in the middle of the road, taking up all the space on either side. At first, we were thinking, this guy's pal probably got his car stuck and called for help. Then this truck guy turns on his headlights, his high beams, and starts revving his engine hard. My friend and I exchange looks, like wondering who's overcompensating for something, and when we turn back, trying to see through the blinding light, we see a silhouette of a big, bulky man. He's standing in front of the truck, hands on his hips, just standing there. We aren't a car's length and a half away from this guy, and there's nowhere to go but left, which we know just leads us back around to the same place. We sit staring at each other for a few moments, trying to decide what to do. My friend starts pulling the car forward at a snail pace, trying to keep as much distance between us and this truck as possible, and we make the left turn. He's just standing there, not moving, looking in our direction. We weren't scared yet, really, but I'm a bit paranoid generally, so I was waiting for him to lunge at the car, throw something at us or something. I don't know, it just really felt off. After we turn, I check the rear view and see the guy holding something as he takes a few steps behind our car in the outline of the light. It's long, barrel-shaped and threatening looking. We peel out of there now, wanting to put distance between us, but forgetting we are stuck in this square of roads. When we get back to about halfway, we begin to see the start of the straightaway in the truck, whose headlights we can still see. We pull off to the side of the road, trying to figure out how we can exactly get out of this situation. I look out the window and see that we are sitting right next to the cemetery we had been looking for, but we are both too freaked to get out now, and we laugh at the irony for a second. Then we see headlights coming from behind us. It's the guy, and it gets closer. We see it's a white SUV, and it slows next to our car. The window rolls down and it's a car full of guys our age. "What are you guys up to out here?" the driver says. "We're just here for a drive." And they say some stuff out of earshot. My friends and I don't have a strong, menacing aura, so we hoped we could just send some chill vibes and have them leave us off the hook for whatever was going on. Were they with the truck guy? Because this wasn't truck guy, but was all too weird. We asked if they'd seen a truck ahead, where they had to have driven in, but they said that they hadn't. When we looked back, we noticed the lights from the oncoming direction were gone. They laugh and pull away slowly, telling us to have a good night, and we pull back onto the road and take off for the exit, only looking out the windows long enough to notice that only the sedan was still there. Sorry, buddy. Hope your car's alright. We made it back to his parents' place without further incident and told them about the encounter, but we couldn't explain what had happened really. It still kind of sounds stupid when I write it out, but something was going on.
This happened 24 years ago in July of 1996. I had finished my term of service for the Army. I was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, and decided at midnight I would out-process and travel back to Wisconsin. All day I was so anxious to go that I had trouble sleeping. Finally, at 23:45, I got out of bed and went to sign out with the desk sergeant. Of course, knowing people wanted to sign out at midnight, he decided to do his rounds. You can't leave until you get your final sign-off with the sergeant and turn in your room key. So I waited, and finally, at 02:45, he returned. I turned my key in, got the sign-off, and at 03:30, I was on my way. At first, I was so full of adrenaline that I felt that I could drive for days. Unfortunately, that adrenaline didn't last long, and by the time I was getting through Dallas, I was nodding off. I decided just past Denton that I would pull over at the next rest stop and take a quick nap until the sun came up. I could barely keep my eyes open when I came up to a stop. I pulled over and got out of my car to get some air and throw something away and to get a look at my surroundings. There were only about 3 other cars and 2 semi-trucks there. It was a picnic stop and not a rest stop, so no restrooms. I threw my trash away and glanced at a poster of a few missing persons, but I really didn't pay any attention to it. I went back to my car, which was a basic Geo Metro. No radio, no power windows, no power locks. I cracked the windows and turned on the boombox I had for some tunes and laid down to get some sleep. I was only asleep maybe 5 or 10 minutes when I felt my car shake just slightly. I cracked an eye open and looked and didn't see anything, so I blew it off and went back to sleep. I then heard what sounded like my door handle being pulled and scratched on the door key. I then sat up quickly, but I didn't see anyone there. I looked at all the windows and didn't see anyone, so again I shrugged it off as me being tired and laid back down and turned up the radio. Being a Texas night in July, it was hot, but I was so tired I just laid back down. A few more minutes later, I heard the door handle again and car really shook. I sat up quickly and saw a man standing at the passenger's side looking in. Even though it was hot and humid, he was wearing a red sweatshirt with the hood up and I couldn't see his face. Being young and dumb and just out of the military, I yelled at him asking, "What the F do you want?" He just stared at me like an idiot and I got out of the car. Mind you, I'm only 5'6", but I was livid. He just walked off towards the picnic tables like nothing happened. All the while, I'm yelling at him that if he came back, I'd take him out. I decided I would just drive on from there. I got back in and went on my way. Even though I was so upset, only about 10 miles down the road, I was super tired again. Luckily, about another 10 miles down I-35, there was another picnic stop. Not sure why North Texas doesn't have rest areas, but they don't. I pulled into the second picnic stop and backed into a spot just in case I needed to leave quickly. Not sure why, but there was only one other car there and no semi-trucks. I again locked the doors, cracked the windows, and turned on my boombox. I fell asleep right away, and about 30 minutes later I hear a loud thud on my driver's side window. I jumped up and looked around, and no one was there. I got out of the car, which was very stupid, but I had my macho military attitude going. But no one was around. I assumed it was my nerves from the other stop. I got back into my car, locked the doors again, and closed my eyes. This time I was too amped up to fall asleep, so I laid there with my eyes closed. I felt that someone was looking at me, and I opened my eyes and saw the guy standing there again with the red sweatshirt, hood up. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could see he was smiling at me. I popped up quick and tried to quickly open the door and bump him. Being a cheap Geo, since the doors were locked, it didn't open. He walked backwards, still staring at me. By the time I got out, he was about 30 feet away, facing me. It was fairly dark, but as I looked him over, he looked really skinny but was about 6'2", maybe 6'3", but I still felt like I could take him with my military experience. He was wearing the red hooded sweatshirt, blue jeans, and green tennis shoes. For some reason, I thought the shoes looked odd. I could see something shine every now and then as he stood there staring at me, and I honestly believe it was a machete. I quickly reached into my back seat and grabbed my baseball bat and started yelling at him to come get some. I'm not really sure why I said that. He started walking towards me and I took a few steps towards him, not really thinking. As I got about 5 feet away from my car and he was now about 15 feet from me, a yellow van pulled up quick and parked just off to the side of the road. I finally realized what was happening and I saw 2 guys also wearing hooded sweatshirts in the van. Before they could get out, I ran back to my car. I had left the keys in the ignition. Since I had backed in, I was able to cut it hard right and peeled my car out of there. I was so lucky. Being a manual car, I didn't stall the car because the other 2 guys were out of the van and the first guy was just about at my car. I jumped back on the interstate and didn't stop until I was about 20 miles into Oklahoma. I stopped for gas and to use the restroom. In the restroom, I noticed that same flyer I barely glanced at the first picnic stop. It was basically a flyer with several missing persons on it and warning people not to stop for long periods of time at the rest areas. It described a possible suspect as possibly 6 foot wearing blue jeans, green shoes, and a red hooded sweatshirt. I completely went white. Needless to say, since it was daylight, I drove the rest of the way to Wisconsin wide awake. Not sure why, but I never reported it to the number on the flyer or told anyone about it. But now I live in North Texas and pass those 2 picnic stops every day on my way to work, and I think about it quite often. This happened on Halloween of 2019. My friends and I were feeling the spooky vibes of the month and wanted to do something fun and exciting to satisfy our thirst. Being the dumb college students that we were, we decided on exploring somewhere allegedly haunted in the hopes of seeing some genuine paranormal activity. Since we're from Illinois, the popular destination of Bachelor's Grove Cemetery immediately came to mind, and it was settled upon. Once the sun had set and night had fallen, we were to make our move, sneaking into the cemetery after it had closed to get the full experience without having to worry about any other visitors. I must admit, I always wanted to do something like this before, but I was genuinely afraid of what might be waiting for us in that cemetery so late at night. Stories always circulated around the various apparitions people had encountered before, the different sounds that chilled them to the bone, and so on. Anyway, all of this was festering inside of me well before we actually started driving over to the cemetery sometime in the evening. It was a pleasantly long drive, but I wasn't really in the mood to think about anything else except for the potential horrors that roam the cemetery for all eternity, or so they say. Couple in the fact that we were going to be trespassing in order to get through in the first place, and I was a nervous wreck. My friends were apparently doing a much better job at keeping their fears in check, though. For the sake of the story, I'll call them Logan, Paul, and Eddie. The entire car ride there, they were laughing and joking around, not worried about what we would be getting into or what we might see. Looking back at the whole situation, I should have known that their optimism was a bad sign. No way would we have been able to explore this place without them being the slightest bit nervous. But what's done is done. A little past 7, once night had finally fallen for real and darkness went on in every direction for as far as the eye could see, we arrived. Parking in the main parking lot was out of the question because we did some looking into it and found that in previous years, local law enforcement liked to wait there and catch any would-be explorers before they could even get inside, so we had a backup plan. Since the actual cemetery was located in the center of a dense forest on all sides, essentially forming a square where all the roads would go around it, we were to park at some restaurant that was open super late and had a huge parking lot, all the way in the back, furthest away from the restaurant itself and closest to the road. This was in the exact opposite direction from the front entrance of the cemetery, so we figured this was our best chance of getting in while avoiding any cops in our way. From there, We'd cross the street on foot and have a bit of a walk before arriving at a somewhat hidden path leading into the forest. Taking this back path would take a bit more to get to the actual cemetery itself, since there were trees particularly thick and dense, but it was well worth it when considering the alternative. After everything was said and done, we found ourselves beginning our trek onto the path, unsure of how far we'd actually have to go before we find what we were looking for. It was a windy night, and even though it wasn't especially cold or anything, I still remember my teeth chattering and my skin going cold. Aside from the occasional sounds of leaves being crunched under our shoes as we walked, there was absolute silence. My once cheerful and energetic friends were now, all of a sudden, quiet and subdued. Logan in particular had this odd expression on his face, it being illuminated by my phone's flashlight as we walked. It was some sort of cross between fear and pain, like every step he took was causing him physical harm. Before I could question him about it, we found ourselves at our destination. Here we were, in the heart of Bachelor's Grove, with graves all around us and a certain chill in the air. Everyone split up to cover more ground, promising to call the others over if they were to encounter something. I didn't want us going too far away from one another, but I also didn't want to seem like a complete baby, so I kept my mouth shut and began exploring. Most of the graves I looked at had withered away from time and the elements, so I couldn't really make out anything that was on the tombstones. The few dates that I could read went back to the late 1800s, and a sinking feeling in my stomach started once I realized these people had been dead and decaying in the ground for over 100 years. Feeling extremely uncomfortable with this realization, I began to back away from the graves and start to look for my friends to see if they had found anything supernatural. Yet when all of a sudden, I heard it. Not just me either. All of us did. It was a low, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention, but with the way our senses were heightened, there was no way we would miss it. It appeared to be some sort of chanting, and it sounded like it was coming a little bit north from our direction, further in a clearing. I couldn't make any of the words being spoken or if it was even in English, but there was something creepy about the tone, like it was religious and the chanting was some sort of prayer. The voice that was doing the chanting was deep and gravelly, belonging to some man that we couldn't see. The four of us shone our lights on each other to see our expressions, and at that moment, we knew what we were going to do. Despite every fiber in my being telling me not to go any further and see what the source of this chanting was, my curiosity got the better of me and I couldn't resist. Eddie whispered to us to turn our lights off completely, while he dimmed his just enough to where it wouldn't attract too much attention, but we would still be able to see with it. The next few moments we spent creeping towards the noise, the more and more I started to lose it. My breathing was uncontrollable, and it felt like my heart was beating 1,000,000 miles an hour. I was so afraid of what we would find, and yet I still had to know. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we had entered the clearing and were a mere few steps away from this chanting. Eddie shone his light in the direction ahead of us, and for just a brief moment, we saw a cloaked figure bent over something in the grass, still chanting in that unrecognizable language. The thing in the grass looked like some sort of circle with a mark in the center, and I swear to God, I wish I could tell you I'm lying about this, but when I realized what the symbol was, I felt like throwing up. There was no mistake. It was a pentagram, made of some strange material. For the moment that Eddie had illuminated the sight in front of us, I had been able to get a glimpse of the pentagram's material being bright red, and I shouldn't have to say any more about that. Once the light from Eddie's phone hit the back of the man's head, he immediately stopped chanting and stood up, still facing the direction of the pentagram. I can only describe the next few minutes as truly unadulterated terror. Before we knew it, he screamed a blood-curdling scream that rattled us to the core and turned around, beginning to sprint towards us. Everything happened so fast, I couldn't even make out the man's facial features except for deep, sunken eyes and an expression that radiated pure hatred. He really did want to bring us harm, and not wasting any time, We all fled the direction we came from and ran faster than I think any of us had ever ran in our entire lives. I couldn't even scream while running. I was too petrified to make any noise. Maybe it was a miracle, but we somehow managed to retrace our steps all the way through the path we took to enter the cemetery and forest, and eventually came out the main road, which was devoid of any traffic for the time being. Afraid of what I would see if I looked back, I made a beeline for the car along with the others and hopped into the back seat, not wasting any time to lock the door and roll up the window. We peeled out of there in no time flat and didn't stop driving 20 over the speed limit until we were at least 10 minutes away. Honestly, I have no idea how far or how long that man chased us, but I do know this for sure. We weren't supposed to be there that night, and we must have been interrupting something important of his. I'll never know what it was, and honestly, I don't hope to ever find out. We never did talk about this experience again after that night, and we never went on another trip to somewhere abandoned or haunted ever again either. I think that fright we felt is enough to satisfy us for the rest of our lives, and I'm thankful beyond words that we all managed to get out together, alive.